of the Cayman Islands.
Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning once again and warm welcome to Money Sense. I'm Simon Cawdery and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio this morning by two guests. My first is Jessica Jablonowski, investment advisor with Radix Financial, an on-island investment advisory firm, and my second is Samantha Conolly, who is an associate with Ogier, but is also a registered and licensed pharmacist in Canada and the Cayman Islands. Our topic this morning is an interesting one, and one that actually deserves a lot more conversation and perhaps doesn't get enough of it. It's an important one which we don't often spend enough attention discussing, and it's a subject of ageing and the protection of the elderly in society as they age, from a financial and legal perspective. Therefore, time does move forwards and we all slowly age, so let us straight away delve into this subject. First of all, of course, welcome Jessica and Samantha to Money Sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Look, I said that we don't talk about the elderly, we don't talk about the aging process enough. Why do you think that is? It seems as though it's so important to do so important to talk to relatives, friends, family members, and yet are we scared of doing so? Are we nervous of doing so? We just don't do it enough. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, I certainly think there's heightened emotions around the topic, right? Like people don't want to face their own mortality, and they know that it's important to plan for it, but actually facing it and doing it is a totally different prospect. There's behavioral aspects there that people just don't want to admit that this time is coming, whether it's next year or 15 years from now. We should be planning well in advance, but it's a tough thing for people for sure.
I think too there is some taboo around it, that if you plan for death will arrive sooner. That's not necessarily the case, but people think that way, that if I put a will in place or I put some provisions in place, that means my death is being counted and is on a timer.
You've prepared for it, yes. But at least you've prepared for it,
right,
rather than not having prepared for it. That's the counterintuitive point about it, isn't it? It's by preparing for it, you make life easier for everybody else around you, and yet people don't, because they're nervous about preparing for something that will happen regardless. It's a strange old situation where we just need to do a better job of all talking about it so much more. But look, but we're going to come to the nitty-gritty of these various subjects. But I think one of the topics that we wanted to delve into are some of the financial risks that are faced by those people who are aging or already elderly. Because we can talk a lot about the planning for aging, and we're going to do that, I think, in the second part of the show. But let's just talk about some of the financial risks that are faced then by the elderly, and why they're perhaps more prone than other people are to these things, and how we do things about it. So Jessica, I think you wanted to say a few things about that, right?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So the elderly, aren't necessarily as tech savvy, aren't keeping up to date with the latest technology, and that inherently leaves them more vulnerable to different types of financial scams, whether that be over the phone or online, through online communications. There are fraudsters out there that are looking to take advantage of people, and unfortunately that is kind of a target demographic for them to reach out to.
I think my mum, who occasionally listens to this show, might argue that she doesn't have a cell phone and therefore couldn't be targeted for a financial scam in that way. But equally, not having a cell phone means she doesn't have the ability to have the fingerprint authentication, the extra security layers. So I'll push back against her argument on that one and support you for sure. Is that because as people get older, they just get less aware of the new technology, or they just don't keep up in attention? What's the background then, do you think, behind why these things affect people of an older disposition?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. I think it can be intimidating for older people to learn how to do the same things a different way too, right? There's definitely blocks put up in that aspect, and technology has been moving so quickly. So it's one of these things. If you're not kind of on the pulse and using it on a day-to-day basis, it can be quite overwhelming to kind of get into that world.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And let's talk about some of the common scams then that are faced by people, and how we perhaps can better prepare ourselves or help them prepare themselves to not be affected, not be impacted quite so much.
Yeah, I think talking about them is probably the first step. We all should be talking about this more, just so people are aware of the types of situations that fraudsters will use to try and deceive and, build trust in certain instances. There's all sorts of different types out there. There's different charity frauds and healthcare frauds, and fraudsters will create a sense of urgency around the situation so that someone feels like they have to act quickly, and that gives them less time to kind of process and evaluate, like, is this a legitimate claim? Should I be sending money to this person, or should I be giving personal details to this person? For charity frauds, they often are centered around natural disasters. So we need to provide hurricane relief, and that needs to happen right now because people are in need immediately. With respect to healthcare, there's different, maybe you get called by someone pretending to be a hospital representative, telling you that you've got an overdue bill that needs to be paid immediately. So kind of creating that urgency again. Kind of probably the most common and that you hear about the most are these relational scams. So whether it be online, whether it's a romance scam or just kind of a friendship, there's a relationship built there. And these are much more complex and can take place over a longer period of time. But effectively, a fraudster will work to build trust first, create a bond with someone, and then after they've kind of built that bond, then suddenly there's an urgent situation. A family member was in an accident and needs money for healthcare costs, or a family member had some situation and they need to pay legal fees straight away. And because, you've built this bond with the person, this is a friend of yours, or more than that, you are inclined to want to help them in these situations.
And what are the red flags then to sort of identify this? So those are some of the things that are affecting people. So how can we better identify or prevent ourselves or stop ourselves going down this? Or what are the paths, what are the things that we should do better to make sure we don't do it? Is it just to pause, to phone a friend and say, hey, I got this message, I got this, what do you think? Is it as simple as that, or are there more complexities involved?
Yeah, I think that's a great first step to take, kind of just step back and reflect. Even though it seems like an urgent situation, you should always just pause, check in with someone, say, just for a second opinion. You also shouldn't be giving out personal details to anyone over the phone, over the internet. That is a red flag in itself. If they're asking you for personal details, for banking details, if they're asking for money in general, if it's something that you were previously unaware of, you should be skeptical at the onset to protect yourself.
I guess a lot of elderly people will look at an email as being, so someone email from a firm, that must be authentic because historically a phone call or letter has always been fairly authentic from your bank. But in email terms, it's so much cheaper to create fraudulent emails than it is to create fraudulent mails and then post them out and then wait the 10 days for someone to deal with it. So it's just so much easier to create fake messaging, isn't it, as opposed to the old-fashioned way of using the postal system. It is,
and it's gotten more and more complex, and they're tougher to spot. But if it's anything banking related, always give a call back to your bank. They will let you know whether or not that is something. And they wouldn't be asking for personal details in any way. They have the personal details on file that they need, so that's not something they'd reach out to you and ask for.
And let's talk a little bit about, a lot of people will be listening to this and say, okay, so you've helped me identify some of the big problems, but I want to learn, I want to do more about this. Who are the best people for them to speak to? Is it as simple as saying an elderly person who's not familiar with technology should really just say, hey, talk to your nephew, talk to your niece, talk to your grandchildren, ask them to set up your phone for you, ask them to set up your computer for you, put on the latest software patches. Is it as simple as that, or are we overly simplifying things?
I think that's a great, certainly something you should do. Talk to everyone you can, get as knowledgeable as you can on these things. The government actually has a really great educational campaign about cybersecurity. what is the website here? It's www.exploregov.ky/cybersafe.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great resources in there, just information, kind of examples of different types of scams to look out for. There's an entire section on older persons, so it's certainly worthwhile to investigate and do your own research.
And then from an investment perspective, you think of an elderly person in their 70s who might be talking to an investment advisor, and the investment advisor recommends a portfolio. You sort of have a trust relationship with that investment advisor, but sometimes investment advisors don't act in the best interest of the client. So how does someone know, oh, this looks like a great product that they're trying to sell me, but actually it's a high commission product, it's only suitable for someone in their 20s. How does somebody identify those sorts of risks, those sorts of problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's tougher for someone who doesn't have the experience and education in the financial realm with investments. Always kind of seeking a second opinion from a trusted loved one or friend who you know might be a bit more knowledgeable on the topic is a great way to go. With financial advisors, you typically are building relationships for the longer term, so you've got that trust there. But as you're approaching someone new, it doesn't hurt to kind of go in prepared with questions. You can go online and find the appropriate questions to be asking about these products and their advice and their services. And talk to more than one financial advisor when you're recruiting someone new, and that way you can compare, and it will make it a little bit easier to see some of these red flags.
Yeah, I guess a good financial advisor should not be upset by a person saying, "Hey, this is a great idea that you give me, but do you mind if I just ask someone else for their view?" They shouldn't be upset by that, should they?
Absolutely not.
And if they are, perhaps that is in itself a
Red flag.
Red flag.
For sure, yeah. Well, what other things would you like to sort of identify as potential red flags that you want people to be more aware of then? Are there any other obvious ones that you feel as though we need to sort of bring to people's attention?
I mean, I think when you're talking about those that may be caring for elderly relatives or friends, they should kind of be on the lookout for different things, different behaviors than what is normal, whether that necessarily be negative or positive or not, anything different, I think, is something that you should look into a little bit more. Because
it's a risk that the elderly relative has been subject to a bad actor who's trying to take advantage of them, you mean?
Absolutely.
Correct.
Yeah.
But that obviously, I guess, relies on having quite an open conversation and honesty about what's going on and being aware of what's going on. Sometimes people are very private. In fact, the older we get, sometimes the more private we are with our financial affairs and the less we want to share with other people, right?
And sometimes, too, the older you get, you're less likely to monitor it as closely as we would now. Yeah. We would monitor it every month or every week because we have bills to pay or we have mortgages or we have various bills. But as they get older, they're not monitoring it as often as we probably would. I
guess because they're scared of the technology, perhaps, that they haven't used the new technology. Nowadays, you monitor things on your phone much more and people haven't downloaded the latest apps. Perhaps it simply comes down to, again, find a relative who's in their 20s and get them to download all the latest gadgets onto their phone for them and help and give them that education experience.
Yeah, or ask your banker if we need to get banking apps downloaded. They'll be happy to help you as well. That's
true. Well, in the first case, you've got to buy a phone, but that's a problem unique to my mother, which we're working on that problem. I think we're just going to take a very short break, and then we're going to come back and continue our conversation on financial and legal planning for the aging and the elderly process.
89.9 Radio Cayman helps you to weather the storm during this hurricane season.
One of the most crucial elements of hurricane preparedness is storm awareness. During the season, it is of utmost importance to pay attention to the latest local weather forecasts, as hurricanes do not suddenly form or strike. There are various methods of advanced notification. Utilizing such may be the difference between a favorable outcome and disaster. Both television and radio serve as excellent mediums with up-to-the-minute storm path information in the wake of a hurricane. Another method of tracking a hurricane may be only arm's length away. Your smartphone or tablet can be your most valuable tool before, during and after a storm, providing countless numbers of apps with crucial hurricane information. Many apps allow you to track storms with moving radar and satellite imagery, plus offer alerts, current conditions, forecasts, advisories, and even video.
This hurricane preparedness tip was brought to you by your community radio station, Radio Cayman 89.9 FM.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense and our continued conversation on the aging and elderly. We started the show discussing with Jessica and Samantha the experiences that some of the issues that elderly people are facing in financial and with technology and financial matters. What I think we want to try and look at now are just the preparation process. We all know that we're going to be aging, and we started at the top of the show saying we all know it, but we do so little about it. But let's assume that we do, or let's assume that we know it and that we're motivated to do something about it. Doesn't mean we do something about it, but we're inclined to do something about it. What are the things that we need to do to prepare ourselves for aging? We obviously need to, I presume we need to sort of build a financial plan. We need to think about wills, trusts, estates. Samantha, maybe you can talk us through some of the legal aspects that we should all be doing giving far more serious thought to.
Once again, most seniors or most persons in general don't think about planning for the future or have a taboo around planning for the future in terms of creating a will or getting a power of attorney set up or creating a trust for their loved ones and their estate. But they really should, and it doesn't have to wait till you're the elderly. You can create a will at any time, especially once you've started to acquire assets in your personal name. That should be done at any time. And it's not as difficult as one thinks. One thinks that they have to, engage an attorney and pay a lot of legal fees, and very intimidating to meet with an attorney, or they have to send an email, and an email sometimes is as easy as picking up a phone to myself or anyone else that's an attorney and asking a few questions.
So perhaps let me pretend I'm as dumb as I could be, which may not be so difficult for the audience to believe, but you say it's as easy as speaking to an attorney, but what sort of attorney deals with wills? When you go on a website for a law firm, there's dozens of different practices that people are. So how do you know which sort of attorney to deal with? Start at the real basics for me.
True. Trust and estate practitioners usually deal with estates and wills. So once you see a designation of a TEP, Trust Estate Practitioner, or any firm that lists their services to include estates practices, usually those would have attorneys that would be able to help you.
And the writing of a will, what does that involve? Because it seems onerous. Maybe it's not. So just talk me through what it actually involves.
So it's basically based on the Wills Act for various jurisdictions, the Wills Act for the Cayman Islands, and it specifies what would be the requirements for a valid will. It's not as onerous as you think. The most important part is to make sure that it's in line with what would make it a valid will, so that you know that it's a will, the intention to create it, and making sure that you have someone that will be the executor, which is the person that after you pass would carry out the wishes of the will. For the Cayman Islands and most common law jurisdictions, we're privileged here to have what we call the ability to make a distribution to anyone. So we have freedom of testamentary, meaning we can leave all of our assets to a charity, or we can leave all of our assets to our cat and dog. We don't have what we call forced heirship rules here, as some civil jurisdictions do. So you can able to draft your will in such a way to leave it to anyone. That's another reason why some people don't go ahead and draft wills as easily, because they're fear that someone will read the will and, the wayward son might be left out of the will, or, the daughter that you spent a lot of time educating and money educating might be left out of the will, as I am for my mom's will. But Some people do that.
So what if you don't write a will? What happens then? Because there always are going to be people who don't write wills, whether because they never get round to it, they forget, they die before they plan to write their will. What happens to the estate of that person in those circumstances?
So if there's anything that is in the person's sole name, if there are things like pension plans, insurance plans that already have assigned beneficiaries, or joint accounts or joint property, then it automatically passes to the assigned beneficiary. If there's no will, then you have to go through what we call you die intestate, and the Succession Act of the Cayman Islands kicks in, whereas it then specifies who will be the next in line to inherit your assets and in what proportions.
So it will try to figure out a logical heir for you.
Right.
There are some countries where if you die in that way, sometimes all the money goes to the government.
Correct.
Which sometimes can be a good spur to write that damn will pretty quickly, so that you
Right.
don't end up gifting the government all your money. But this in Cayman, then it will.
It's usually family. So usually first in line is the spouse, and then if they have any children, the children, any grandchildren. If there's no spouse, no children, then it goes upwards. So any living parents of that person, and living grandparents of that person.
So that's a helpful process, because at least not to say that one shouldn't be writing wills, but at least there's a clear lineation of what happens afterwards,
Correct.
right? So that's a positive. But equally, you may want to better allocate how your funds or your
Right.
wealth is distributed upon your death.
And the will be the only mechanism or guidance that you would have to be able to do that.
So
it's better to do a will.
One question that I think of when you say this is going to the lawyer for the first time. Intimidating. You're going to be talking about something quite macabre with somebody you don't perhaps know, and there's going to be quite a lot of time spent on the lawyer's side trying to understand what it is the person wants to be doing. So there must be some obvious prep work that an individual, say for myself, I should be doing before I go to the lawyer, because it's no good me going to the lawyer and say I'd like to write a will. Presumably they're then going to come back with 20 questions that would be better if I had thought of beforehand and given some consideration to. So talk me through that then.
So initially, if you reach out to someone and you want to do a will, initially what they'll do is they will send you a will questionnaire.
Oh, perfect.
So the will questionnaire will set out the type of things that you should be thinking about. For example, who do you want to be your executor of your will? If you have minor children, and should you and your spouse pass within 30 days of each other, who would you want to be guardians of your will? And then it would ask you, what are your assets? We're not trying to be nosy, but we're really trying to ascertain, do you really own those? Because only things that you own in your personal capacity will pass under a will.
And also sometimes people might have a savings account that they opened 25 years ago, they forgot about, and it's a good chance to try and remind yourself what
Right.
you've got and where you've got it.
Yes.
Because otherwise it can be really difficult to get access to it later.
Right.
Now, one subject that sort of links into this then is the nature of, okay, so you write a will, you prepare yourself for that, and then that's very clear upon death what happens. But we're seeing with people, particularly as they age and the longevity of life increases, we're seeing an increasing prevalence of things like dementia and Alzheimer's in elderly people. And that's obviously happens before you get to the state of a will. So the obvious question is, well, I've prepared for the date when I will die, but what do you do to prepare yourself in the event that those sorts of circumstances happen where you're no longer necessarily capable of making decisions for yourself? Is there a process there then?
So right now there is not what we call enduring powers of attorney in the Cayman Islands. So a power of attorney gives someone the ability to act on your behalf. Say you should become unable for traveling reasons, or if you're bedridden, for example, but you must have what we call mental capacity for a power of attorney to still be active. Once you lose the mental capacity, the power of attorney is no longer active. So this is while you're alive, right? Someone can act on your behalf. If you're unable to go to the bank or unable to do any kind of transaction, that person can use that document and act on your behalf. So usually it's a spouse or one of your children, or a trusted advisor or something like that could be your power of attorney. Unfortunately, it's in the works right now to amend the law, the Power of Attorney Act, to make sure that we have what we call enduring powers of attorney. So when you do lose capacity, or when you have some sort of dementia, or maybe you're even in a coma, for example, someone else can still act on your behalf, knowing before you got to that stage what your wishes would have been. So this is very important for us right now, and it's in the legislation to be amended. Besides that, it's very important for us to do this before we get to that stage. So a will, or some sort of speaking to someone who knows what your wishes are, because thereafter it will probably be a next of kin to make those decisions for you. We do have a medical advance directive now that you can do while you have capacity, that will speak to medical issues and medical treatment once you lose capacity. So if you again were in a coma, or again had dementia, or had to be put on a feeding tube, or had to be put on a respirator, you could speak to your wishes while you're in a good state of what you would like to happen when you're not in such a good state. And that's available now, and that does not diminish if you lose capacity.
It seems to me, though, even though we don't have the enduring power of attorney, I think you described it as yet, there's no harm when you prepare your will to at least build in some provisions for when that law changes, so that then you can actually have that already enacted in your own documents. You go to a lawyer and say, I appreciate it's not valid yet, but at least start the preparing planning, so that when the law does change, you've got it really inactive, as opposed to, oh well, let's not think about it because it's not valid. Then you forget to think about it at all, right?
Right.
And it also seems to me, and perhaps hopefully maybe I'm mistaken, but Jessica, that the building of a will, or the drafting of a will, seems to go hand in hand with go and talk to your financial advisor about what your financial affairs are going to be, so that when you go to your lawyer to say, here's my will, you've got your financial affairs in order, you know where your assets are, they're planned, they're organised. Is that a logical conclusion to draw?
Absolutely. It's I think it's kind of two-stage planning, and the two things work together. When we're running scenarios and kind of building out a financial plan, healthcare costs are usually the biggest expense in retirement for people. Obviously, everyone's subject to their specific situation, but typically that's the case, and we obviously want to make sure that we're inflating that at the appropriate rate. We use the healthcare index out of the consumer price index, so that long run average on that is about 5.2%, compared to kind of the long run general inflation rate of 2.5%. It's double, and that's definitely something that you need to prepare for.
Fair enough. Look, I think we're very close to being out of time, but I think the key, one of my key takeaways from here is, if you don't have a will, if you haven't planned for what will inevitably happen, go and do it. And if you don't know what your financial state of affairs is, it's very difficult to prepare for the future. Very difficult to prepare for your eventual death. So get that organised as well. Get a list. Get a table of where your assets are, what they are. Some people might have it in an account in a company name. Well, figure out what's what and just make a list of what you have, and then go and get the damn thing written, because it saves a lot of pain and trauma for the family members, presumably, if you die and you don't have one of those things.
Correct.
And it's never too early.
Yeah. And so getting it done then, it's as simple, you're saying, as go on a few websites, look at some law firms, find people who have these practices of trust, estate planning, or talk to friends, right? Logically, at least one of your friends probably has done it. Yes. I know one of mine has. He's given me a copy of his will, which I put in a safe place in the office. So he's given it to 2 or 3 people in case one person doesn't have it. And just find out, go and ask your friends, did you like the lawyer you used? Were they a good person? Were they helpful? Were they constructive? Correct. Just have that conversation, because there's no shame in writing it, right?
No, not at all.
Excellent. Well, look, we are, as always on Money Sense, out of time, and still with many more topics and conversations that we could go to. It's a really it's a really important topic, and one which we spent 25 minutes or so here, and I thank you both for your time. We could spend another 25, 40 minutes and go into a lot of detail, but and we should, of course, but we can't. And so I just encourage anyone who's listening who hasn't got their financial affairs organised in this respect, go and find your financial advisor, go and find your lawyer, and it doesn't take a lot of time, and it's not as painful as you might think it is, but it is a topic that will affect every single one of us.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, look, thank you again, Samantha. Thank you again, Jessica, for joining me this morning on Money Sense. It's been a pleasure having you. And our time is up, so let me just say it once again, thanks to our audience for joining us, and please do tune in to Money Sense in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you, Simon. And studio time now by Price Right is 8:01.
Summer is heating up.
And Priced Right is sizzling.
Splash down into Priced Right Sizzling Summer for a chance to dive into our prize pool worth over